This is Rebel Therapist, a podcast for entrepreneurs who are trained as therapists and who want to level up their businesses, make a bigger impact, feel fulfilled, and be very well paid. I'm your host, Annie Schuessler. I think we're generally out of balance on how much of our brain energy we give to certain numbers. Like, how many likes did I get for that post? I want the numbers that I track and that I encourage my clients and listeners to track to be highly meaningful and helpful in making real business decisions. And I also never want numbers to make me or you feel bad or assess our worthiness. Fuck that. Let's talk about useful numbers. These numbers help us make decisions, they help us pay attention to what we care about, and they help us see what's working in the areas of our business that we care about. And then less useful numbers or useless numbers tend to stress us out, distract us, and just take us away from what matters to us. Most people I know don't like to spend very much time tracking or analyzing numbers in their businesses. Now, I, on the other hand, can actually tend to over-track and analyze and pay too much attention to this stuff. I'm one of those people who likes to deal with my anxiety by believing that I have some control. And sometimes tracking numbers and having a bunch of spreadsheets can make me feel like I've got some control over my life. Ha! But as a company of one person, not a huge corporation, I don't have time or energy to track every single number in my business. So I have discovered that less is more when it comes to paying attention to numbers in my business. Some numbers are super helpful, and paying attention to these numbers, which I will get to in a moment what they are, paying attention to these numbers can fight things like recency bias. Recency bias is where this thing just happened, so our brain tells us this always happens, or this happens quite often when it perhaps just happened recently. Or sunk cost fallacy. And that's when I think, hey, I spent money or time on this thing, so I've got to keep doing it, or I've got to keep paying for it until it pays off. When, actually, it might be better to just stop doing that thing or stop paying for that thing. And then it also helps us to fight against confirmation bias. That's where I believe this thing works, so I notice when I'm right about that, and I just don't notice any data that would not support my bias. Or it also helps fight against shiny object syndrome. And that's, we all know that one. Look at this new thing. This is fun. Or this is going to work because it's new. Or this is going to work because it's being marketed to me very effectively. A quick tangent on that one. When you are considering paying for something new or starting something new in your business, in addition to using numbers to help you make your decision, also try this. Thea Monnier just said this, and it's so useful. Take at least 60 seconds, breathe, do what you need to do to find peace and pleasure in your body, because wisdom lives there, before you make the decision. And I'm going to add to that, talk it through with a friend, borrow their groundedness. I was recently considering investing in something in my business, and I ran it by my smart and grounded friend, Podge. And she asked me a few good questions, and I knew right away it wasn't actually the right time to do that thing. All right, end of tangent. So for people like me who rely heavily on intuition and what people might call witchiness, numbers provide an additional helpful ingredient. I'm going to talk about two kinds of analysis that I like to engage with, two kinds of numbers I like to keep and analyze, and that I also encourage my clients to keep and analyze. So the first kind of numbers and analysis are the kinds that you always do. So I imagine I am always going to track and pay attention to these kinds of numbers. And then the second kind is the ones that you will track and pay attention to for short-term experiments. So first, let's get into the first one, the numbers that I will probably always pay attention to. I'm always going to probably pay attention to the number of hours I'm working. I actually use a time tracking app, and I use a free one. And I do this and have been doing it for years because I want to know how many hours I'm working, and I want to know in what categories I'm working in during those hours. Time is not a renewable resource, and I run a tiny company, and I don't work very many hours. So what I do with my time is the most important number I can measure. And to analyze that, for me, what that means is looking at the relationship between the numbers in my business and my time. So the 4 big categories I spend my time in are work with my clients and creating new curriculum. That's the biggest one. And then there's administration, which is just basically anything behind the scenes that's not creative. And then there's marketing, and there's creating this podcast. So besides this podcast, other marketing includes things like writing emails to my list, posting on social media, running live events, being a guest on other podcasts, and talking to my referral partners. Now, I work very few hours. Actually, if you want to know more about that and find out how many hours I work, email me at info@coachingwithannie.com. And if I get a bunch of emails about that, I'm going to create more content about time in your business. The second big thing I track is how my clients found me. This is easy to collect. You got to ask either in conversation with every single person you start working with or in your onboarding process in some way, where did you first find me? So I ask people this in writing as they're signing up for my offerings. And I absolutely keep that information handy so that I can see it over time. Now, this is what's called a lag indicator, meaning you're looking back to see what's happened. And this tends to be helpful for long-term strategy, seeing what's working over time. So I can tell you that 1/3 of my recent participants found me through my podcast, and about 1/3 found me through direct referrals, and then the rest find me in other ways. And I could also tell you, because I have this information handy, that 2 years ago, a lot more of my participants were finding me through me guesting on other people's podcasts. And that number has been going down over the last couple years. And I have not been doing as much guesting over the last couple years. So my numbers tell me that it makes a lot of sense for me to spend some of my time pitching myself to podcast hosts who I respect and connecting meaningfully with my referral partners. So as an introvert, I need those numbers to remind me about that. There's less friction for me to just spend time not connecting with people in that way. And it's easier for me to remember to just create more content. But the return on getting in front of other people's audiences is really undeniable when I look at the numbers. And yes, I almost always feel fulfilled by having those conversations. So it's just a friction issue for me. So it's a good idea to track how your clients found you over a long period of time. And most of the best marketing strategies are going to work over time. So building a referral relationship, podcasting, podcast guesting, nurturing an email list, search engine optimization, all those things can work right away. And I've definitely had people find me through search and enroll in CYP that same day. But most of the seeds that you plant in all of those places are going to sprout over months or years. So how all your clients found you in a given quarter or year is really valuable to show you for sure what worked and what you should be doing more of. The third big thing I track is my clients' results. And yeah, I want to say there's a balance between having a great program or service that supports people and hooking your own value to other people's results. So yes, you're not responsible for other people's results. They are. And if you have a really good service or a really good program, you're going to see people's results improving. So both of those things can be true at the same time. So I'll tell you about how this works for me with my program, Create Your Program. I've noticed that if I can help my participants walk all the way over the finish line to actually announcing their phenomenal programs, they're way more likely to go on to run those programs, reiterate those programs, and help more people and make really good money. So that's what I measure. And in measuring that, I've added things to help even more people get their registration pages complete and launch their programs. So I added Nausea Week, which is week 11 of my program now, where people just co-work together, take the steps, and get encouraged to actually launch their programs. Because I discovered that after they know exactly what to do, they can still use more support in actually implementing that stuff. And I added another bonus training that they only get if they turn in their registration page by the end of CYP. And so now about 80% of folks have been sharing their registration pages by the end. And yeah, there's another 20% of people, but those people have not failed. They still have the ability to continue on their own timeline, get their registration pages done, and there is absolutely no shame in going at their own pace. I just like to get that first number up and have more people getting their registration pages done and launched before the end of the program. Another thing I pay attention to is how satisfied each participant is with each module in the program. If you have a structured program beyond your therapy practice, you probably also want to identify what numbers might represent progress or success or healing, and then track and pay attention to those numbers. Now, there's some other things that I have to measure anyway, and so do you because of the IRS. And some of those numbers are really useful. Overall revenue is something that you probably already know in your business, and I think it's useful to break it down into your different offers. If you only have one offer, you don't have to worry about this. But if you've got more than one offer, it's helpful to see which of your offers is bringing in the most money and see how that compares to the time you put into it and how much fulfillment it brings you. And maybe you analyze that across time. You might have a new offering and you might give it quite a while to start bringing in significant money. So I remember year one in my coaching business, I think that's when I brought in $7,000 with my coaching, and my therapy practice was bringing in the vast majority of my income. And I remember feeling discouraged about that number and even embarrassed about that number. But now I look back on that as just a great start that I didn't need to take so seriously, and that it wasn't going to take that long to add a zero to it. So now I know if you can make $2,000 with a new offer in the first year, you can probably make $20,000 with it or $200,000 with it in a later year. So across time, I measured how my coaching business was doing compared to my therapy business. And as the coaching business grew, it allowed me to decide to shrink my therapy practice and then let it go completely 5 years ago. And now I'm getting back into some healing work. And I'm working with folks who are estranged from a parent or caregiver and using brain spotting and other things. And I'm not wanting to put pressure on my healing practice financially, but I do want to give it some room in this next chapter of my life. So I will be tracking my income in that particular area of my business just so that I can know what's going on there and I can make good decisions. Now I'm going to tell you why revenue alone is not a big enough part of the picture. I'm going to give you an example. Whenever I work with someone one-on-one, I send them a questionnaire to get some numbers before we meet. I worked with someone recently who wasn't getting enough people signing up for their offers, and they had a tiny email list and a lot of offerings. And they were adding offers to solve a revenue problem. But their conversion rates were good, and so that means they were getting a good number of signups considering the size of their audience. Their audience just wasn't big enough to fill their offers. So what they needed to do instead of adding offers was to get in front of more people with their most popular free offer in order to grow their email list. So if all I had known was their revenue and I just jumped into coaching them, I might have given them the wrong advice. So I asked a few questions about their numbers to fill in the picture and be able to give them better guidance. All right, the next number that you have to track anyway, and it can be very useful, is your expenses, your business expenses. So you have to track these because taxes, and I like to make this meaningful. Now, Barry Tesler talks about naming your categories in ways that matter to you and align with your values, and then translating those for your accountant at the end of the year. I think Barry calls things related to her house sanctuary or something like that, so that it means something to her. In my business, I make my expenses tracking meaningful by separating out things like what I pay guest teachers in my program. And I also track what percentage of expenses goes to companies that are POC owned. And I don't have precision around that, but I analyze it roughly to make sure I'm on the right track. So that's it for what I always track and analyze. The other things I analyze are short term. Whenever I start a new project in my business, I'm always running it as an experiment. And I want to see signs that it's working or not working as soon as possible. So if I decide to run a new free live event, like something on a new topic, you bet I'm looking to see how many people sign up and show up and how that compares to other events I've run. My most popular event every year is my planning workshop in December. And the second most popular event in 2024 was a new workshop on niching. So I'll probably do both of those again, partly because the numbers tell me that they work to bring in new people and to engage the people who are already on my list or already listening to this podcast. When I was running Meta ads, I paid close attention to all the metrics, especially return on ad spend. And that means how many people actually paid to work with me because they found me through a Meta ad. Now, that is not the number that Meta will tell you to pay attention to, by the way. They want you to spend as much as possible on ads, and they do not care about how much money you make from ads. They want eyeballs to stay on their platform. And if I were to do an experiment with creating more reels on Instagram, I would track both the time I'm spending on it and how many people visited my website as a result. I wouldn't pay so much attention to number of views or likes or follows because, again, that's what Meta is trying to get me to pay attention to keep people on their platform. And if I were to do some work to change my search engine optimization, I would analyze how the traffic to my site was changing, if there was an increase, and if that increase was leading to an increase in clients. So really, any experiment I do, I want to think about what numbers will help me know how it's going. And then, of course, every one of these experiments, I'm going to also pay attention to how I feel in my body and what my intuition tells me about the experiment. And for me, I've got to be careful not to run too many experiments at once because I'm one person here and I don't want to be tracking too many things at once. So those are the two categories of numbers I really pay attention to. One is the things that I am always paying attention to, and then the things I'm paying attention to just during an experiment. And then for me, like I told you earlier, I can tend to be tracking too many things. I need to let one experiment go before I start another one. Now, here's a kind of number I try to pay less attention to: vanity metrics. And we all need to beware of vanity metrics. Vanity metrics tend to be things that are visible to others or that are lacking of any real meaning because they lack context. And they don't tell a meaningful story until and unless we see a relationship between numbers. Sometimes corporations like Meta or Apple are hoping that you're going to pay attention to these vanity metrics, and in that way, you're going to give them your labor for the attention economy for their platform. So maybe the worst thing about vanity metrics is that they can make us feel bad. There's always going to be someone who has higher numbers than you do in any of these areas. So I'm not saying I never look at vanity metrics. I mean, they're right there. They're hard to miss. I'm just saying I want to know when I'm looking at vanity metrics and when I'm looking at something useful. So I'll give you examples of some things that can be vanity metrics. The number of followers you have on a social platform. So that lacks context about how many of those followers are humans and what percentage of those humans are even seeing your posts. I interviewed Therapy Jeff Gunther, and when he was on the pod, we were celebrating this vanity metric because yay, Jeff. But you also heard him talk really thoughtfully about the more meaningful numbers underneath, like an actual increase in referrals. Another number that can be a vanity number is the number of email subscribers. even though your email list really matters. But just the number of subscribers on its own lacks context of how many of those people are opening the emails or showing interest in working with you. And then, as I mentioned before, there's revenue. On its own, that can be a vanity metric because it lacks expenses and actual take-home pay. So when someone tells me they have a 7-figure business, I want to know how much they're actually taking home. I've talked to too many people who hit 7 figures and kept waiting for their own take-home pay to increase, and also who were waiting for their own number of hours to decrease and just kept waiting and waiting even as their company's revenue kept rising. Another vanity metric can be number of podcast listeners, and that lacks the context of how many listeners have signed up to work with you, or in what way at all this podcast is bringing you dollars. Now, if you're an influencer rather than a service provider, I know you're looking at numbers in totally different ways. And in that case, something like number of followers or likes or pod listeners might matter to you in a different way. But people who listen to this podcast are usually not trying to be influencers. They are well-paid service providers. If you want to get my help creating your signature program beyond therapy sessions, head over to rebeltherapist.me/create, and I would love to support you. I want to thank Ames Palms for editing this podcast. If you found this episode supportive, please do a couple of things. Share it with your favorite therapist or healer. That is absolutely the most important way we reach more people. And if you haven't already, please hit follow and give us 5 stars. That is so helpful to this podcast. And thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.